This is the second of our series about the stories of the elder monks and nuns. This one will be about the story of Patacara. During the time of the Buddha, there was a rich family who had a beautiful young daughter named Patacara, who was very dear to her parents. In those days, as was the tradition, the custom, they chose a husband for her out of another wealthy family. But she had already fallen in love with a servant boy, a poor man. So she didn't want to get married to the son of the rich family. Instead, she ran away with the servant boy, and they traveled to a faraway place to get married there. So there they lived happily for some time. And after a little while, she became pregnant. And now, to give birth to her son, it was customary or usual to travel to the house of one's parents. But now she was living far away from her parents, and she had nobody around to help her or who would know what to do. So she asked her husband if he would give her permission to go back to see her family. And she was sure that they would forgive her if they knew that she was going to have a son. But her husband was terrified. He thought that they would kill him if they saw him for running away with her. So he refused to go. So then eventually Patacara said, okay, I can't give birth to my son on my own. There's nothing to do. I have to just go to see my parents, even if my husband doesn't agree. So one day, as the time for her labor was coming near, she set off into the woods on the road back towards the house of her parents. Now, when her husband discovered that she was missing, he ran after her to beg her to come back. But just as he reached her, she started to have pains of labor, and she realized that she was going to give birth right then. And so there was nothing to do. They had to find a little place to shelter in the forest, and she gave birth to a son. So she brought the son home with her husband, and everything was fine then until it happened that she became pregnant with a second child. And again, more or less the same turn of events happened. She wanted to go home to her parents, but her husband was still too afraid. And so again she ran away by herself. Again, just as the time of her labor was drawing close. And again her husband ran after her. And just as had happened with the first child, just as her husband reached her and was asking her to come back, she refused, and at that moment she started to feel the pains of giving birth. Now at the same time, it started to rain and the winds were becoming stronger and stronger, so there was a great storm brewing. So she asked her husband, please, my dear, I can't give birth like this in the middle of the storm. Can you go and find some branches and logs to build a shelter fast? So her husband ran into the woods, looking to try to find something with which he could build a shelter for her, or looking to find a place where she could shelter. But as he was on his way, he wasn't looking where he was going so much that he was in a rush, plus it was dark and the rain made it difficult to see. And there was a poisonous snake that he stepped on, and it bit him. So he died right there. Meanwhile, Patacara waited for her beloved husband, her pains becoming more and more severe, until finally, without him coming back, she gave birth to another son. When morning came, she went in search of her husband until she finally found him lying dead on the ground, having been bitten by the snake. And on seeing this sight, we can hardly imagine her distress, her despair. My husband has been killed, and it's my fault. She wondered what she could do, being now lost in the world without her supporter. And finally she decided to continue along the path that she was on already, which led back to her parents' house. There she hoped she could find refuge. So with her two children, one a newborn son which she carried with her, and the other her young boy of 2 years old, she continued along her path, weary and heartbroken. The only thing that kept her going was the hope of finding her parents and a home for her children. Now on her way there was a wide river which she had to cross. If she had been by herself, it would have been not difficult, but both of the two children could not go across by themselves. Patacara was not able to carry both of them at the same time, so she decided to first bring the youngest, the baby, across, to leave him there, and then to go back for her elder son. So with some difficulty, carrying her youngest child over the head, she managed to get across the great river, and she left him on the other side, telling, "I'm coming back in just a moment." But just as she was halfway across the river, she heard a sound that made her turn around. And she turned around just in time to see a great eagle, a bird of prey, swooping down and picking up her youngest child, her baby, that had just been born, in its beak and going off with it. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" she cried, waving her arms to try to frighten the bird. But it was no use. The bird had already gone, carrying her baby in its beak. Meanwhile, her elder son, who was just about 2 years old, heard his mother calling. He couldn't really hear what she was saying, and saw her waving her arms. Thinking, "Ah, my mother is calling me," he ran straight forward into the river. And before Patacara had time to reach him, the current had swept him away. So stricken with horror was poor Patacara that for a moment she couldn't even move, she couldn't do anything. But finally she made her way to the other side of the river and continued on her way, crying as though she would never stop, with all the heaviness of the world in her heart, going to find her only possible source of comfort to tell the story to her parents and let them take her in their arms. After some time she finally reached the outskirts of the city and was asked by another passing traveller where she was going. On giving him the address, on telling him the location of her house and the family who lived there, a look of horror came over the face of the man. "Oh, please, young madam, please don't tell me your family is there. Please tell me that you have a family in another house. Please tell me you were mistaken." "No," replied Patacara, "that is the house of my family. Tell me what has happened." "I am so sorry to tell you this," replied the man, "but there was a great storm last night, and the house collapsed. Everybody inside was killed." It was in this way that Patacara lost her husband, her 2 sons, and her whole family in the space of 1 day. Her grief was unimaginable, such that she almost lost her reason. She wandered around the city, not realizing that her clothes were torn, unable to speak except for crying. After a little time, it happened that the Buddha came to that city, and as he was teaching there one day, Patacara came near. The Buddha told the people around to give her some clothes, because of her clothes being all torn, she was almost half naked. So she was given some clothes, a blanket to wrap around herself. As she listened to the Buddha talking, it was like a fog was cleared away from her eyes and she could think and see clearly again. He spoke of how all the source of all suffering was the love and attachment, whatever is dear, of how many times previously whoever we have loved and lost has already been lost to us, how many times we have cried over them. These words were speaking directly to the heart of Patacara. When he spoke of how everything that is loved is lost, that all one's dreams and hopes inevitably turn to ashes, turn to dust, she understood this in the depth of her heart, in her marrow, in her cells, in her bones. She could see its truth, she had lived it. How could she deny it? And so it was right there and then that she became Sotapanna, a stream enterer, and she asked to become a nun, in the Buddha's teaching. Not long afterward, with constant effort driven by pure determination and willpower, she became Arahan. When we listen to this story or when we read it, we have to try to see the world through the eyes of Patacara, to understand just how deeply fed up one like Patacara is, how entirely uninterested one like Patacara is in going to find another husband, have more children, build another palace of crystal only for it to collapse sooner or later. No, there is no way she would do such a thing. She is one who has entirely and completely lost hope in the dream of any such crystal palace. Is gone, crushed, become ashes. What the Buddha teaches, and what we have to see too, is that this really is the deepest truth of the world that we all refuse to see, that we all refuse to look at, that we all don't want to accept. That everything is just ashes in waiting, here 1 second and gone the next. So it means that everything is torn away from you. The harder you stick to it, the more you are torn apart with it. Patacara's story is another example of somebody's extreme suffering pushing them to a realization of something that is true for everyone, but that nobody sees. So that because of this, we all continue to repeat the same mistake again and again and again, eternally expecting it to work this time, to be good this time, to be true this time, to be solid, secure this time. But it never is. Whether it takes a long time, or as for Patacara, in the space of just 24 hours, the dream falls apart, dissolves. It burns up into ashes. And yet what Patacara was also able to find, from going through the greatest possible suffering, she found the highest happiness, the highest contentment, the highest truth, which is also to be found within ourselves, within every one of us. But whether we practice to find it or not is up to us.